There is something I need you to understand today. Something that has been quietly unfolding behind the scenes of your life while you were focused on surviving, healing, growing, and becoming. You may think your soulmate noticed you all at once. You may believe there was a single moment when everything changed. But what I am about to reveal is far deeper than that. Because the truth is, they did not fall for a mask. They did not become drawn to a version of you that was pretending to be stronger, happier, or more complete than you truly were. No. What touched their heart was something far more powerful. It was the moment they began seeing the real you. And once that happened, something inside them could never return to the way it was before. For a long time, they only saw fragments. Small pieces. Passing glimpses. Tiny reflections of the person heaven created you to be. But a soul can recognize what eyes cannot fully understand. And little by little, without even realizing it, they began paying closer attention. Not because they were trying to. Not because someone told them to. But because something about your energy kept calling them back. Have you ever wondered why certain people remain in your thoughts long after a conversation ends? Why some faces disappear while others seem impossible to forget? Why one person's presence feels ordinary, while another person's presence lingers like a song that refuses to leave your heart? There is a reason. And your soulmate has been asking themselves these very questions. Even when they could not explain it. Even when logic tried to convince them otherwise. Even when circumstances made no sense at all. Because what they were feeling was not built on appearances. It was not built on convenience. It was not built on fantasy. It was built on recognition. Soul recognition. The kind that happens quietly. Long before words ever catch up. You see, my child. The world teaches people to notice perfection. But souls are drawn to authenticity. And there came a moment when your soulmate caught a glimpse of something most people never allow others to see. Your truth. Your sincerity. Your heart. Perhaps it happened during a conversation. Perhaps it happened through a simple act of kindness. Perhaps it happened when you thought nobody was paying attention. Yet that was the very moment their heart began paying the closest attention of all. Because authenticity carries a frequency that cannot be imitated. It cannot be manufactured. It cannot be forced. It simply is. And when they encountered that frequency within you, walls they did not even know existed began to weaken. Suddenly, the image they had created in their mind was no longer enough. They wanted to know more. They wanted to understand you. They wanted to discover what existed beneath the surface. But here is the part you do not know. The deeper they looked, the more unexpected their feelings became. This frightened them. Not because your soul was too much, but because your soul was real. And reality has a way of demanding honesty. It asks difficult questions. Questions many people spend years avoiding. Questions such as, what if this connection is different? What if this person matters more than I planned for? What if my heart already knows something my mind is still trying to figure out? Those questions have been echoing inside them far longer than you realize. And lately, those echoes have become impossible for them to ignore. Something is changing. A shift has already begun. The signs are subtle now. Almost invisible. But soon, even they will no longer be able to pretend they do not feel what they feel. Because another realization is approaching. A realization that will force them to confront a truth they have been slowly discovering about you. And when that truth finally reaches the surface, everything they thought they understood about this connection may change forever. But before that happens, there is one hidden detail about what they recently realized that you must hear first. And it explains why their heart has become far more invested than they ever intended, there is something remarkable that happens when a person stops looking at someone through the eyes of expectation and begins seeing them through the eyes of truth. That is where your soulmate finds themselves now, standing between what they once believed and what their heart is beginning to reveal. Because the more they observed you, the more a quiet realization started forming inside them. You were not who they expected. You were something far more meaningful. Many people enter our lives and show us what we want to see. Very few reveal who they truly are. Yet every time life gave you a reason to become bitter, you chose growth. Every time circumstances gave you a reason to close your heart, you continued carrying kindness. Every time disappointment tried to define your future, you kept moving forward. And whether you know it or not, your soulmate noticed. Not necessarily all at once. Not in a dramatic moment. But through countless small observations that slowly painted a picture impossible to ignore. They saw how you handled difficulties. They saw how you treated people when there was nothing to gain. They saw the strength you carried during moments when few others would have remained standing. And something unexpected happened. Their admiration began turning into something deeper. Something quieter. Something far more powerful. Because admiration can be temporary. But genuine emotional connection grows roots. The kind that reach beneath appearances. Beneath circumstances. Beneath fear. You see, my child. Many people are attracted to what shines. But souls are transformed by what endures. And your soulmate has begun realizing that your light is not dependent upon perfect conditions. It comes from within. That realization changed everything. Because once someone recognizes the source of another person's light, it becomes very difficult to forget them. Even when they try. Even when distance exists. Even when life becomes busy. The memory remains. The feeling remains. The connection remains. And lately, those feelings have been resurfacing in unexpected ways. Moments that should have been ordinary suddenly remind them of you. Conversations trigger memories they thought had faded. Simple details bring your presence back into their thoughts. Again. And again. And again. At first they dismissed it. Then they questioned it. Now they are beginning to wonder if there is a reason they cannot seem to move past what their heart keeps returning to. But here is the hidden struggle they rarely reveal. Part of them still fears what these feelings could mean. Not because they doubt your value. Not because they doubt the connection. But because genuine feelings create genuine vulnerability. And vulnerability requires courage. The courage to acknowledge what is real. The courage to admit when someone has become important. The courage to stop running from emotions that refuse to disappear. That courage is growing inside them now. Slowly. Steadily. Like a sunrise appearing over a distant horizon. At first it is almost impossible to notice. Then suddenly, the darkness begins losing its hold. And that is exactly what is happening within their heart. The confusion is weakening. The resistance is softening. The truth is becoming harder to deny. Yet there remains one final barrier. One final question they have been wrestling with in silence. A question connected to timing. A question connected to readiness. A question connected to whether they are prepared to follow what their heart is trying to tell them. And what they decide next may become one of the most important turning points in this entire journey. Because very soon, a situation is going to place them face to face with a realization they can no longer avoid. When that moment arrives, the feelings they have kept buried beneath the surface may finally rise into the light. And when they do, nothing about this connection will feel the same again. But before that moment unfolds, There is something happening inside their heart right now that changes everything. Something they have not fully admitted to themselves yet. And it is far more powerful than you imagine. Sometimes the greatest changes in life do not begin with action. They begin with acceptance. And that is precisely where your soulmate stands now. Not at the end of a journey, but at the edge of a realization that has been quietly approaching for far longer than they understand. Because there is something they can no longer escape. No matter how busy they become. No matter how many distractions appear. No matter how many times they tell themselves to focus elsewhere. Your presence continues finding its way back into their heart. Not through force. Not through obsession. But through significance. There is a difference. A profound difference. People forget what is ordinary. But they remember what changes them. And somewhere along this path, you changed something inside them. Perhaps you never intended to. Perhaps you never even knew. Yet your influence has reached places within their spirit that few others have ever touched. That is why the connection keeps returning. That is why the feelings keep resurfacing. That is why the questions continue growing louder. Because the heart has a remarkable way of protecting truths until the soul is finally ready to receive them. And lately, their soul has been becoming ready. More ready than ever before. There have been quiet moments when they felt it. Moments they rarely speak about. Moments when everything became still for just a second. And a thought of you appeared out of nowhere. A memory. A feeling. A possibility. Something gentle. Yet impossible to ignore. At first they pushed it away. Then they tried to rationalize it. But now, they are beginning to sit with it. To listen. To wonder. And that subtle shift changes everything. Because once a person stops resisting what they feel, the truth begins revealing itself. Slowly. Patiently. Layer by layer. Like sunlight moving across a landscape hidden in darkness. And what your soulmate is starting to see has surprised them. They are beginning to understand that their feelings were never as small as they pretended. Never as temporary as they assumed. Never as simple as they hoped. What they thought was curiosity has become emotional attachment. What they thought was admiration has become affection. What they thought was a passing connection has become something their heart keeps choosing again and again. Even in silence. Even in absence. Even when no one else knows. Yet here is the revelation that catches them off guard. The more they acknowledge these feelings, the more they begin seeing you differently. Not as a possibility. Not as a distant idea. Not as someone who merely crossed their path. But as someone who genuinely matters. Someone whose happiness matters. Someone whose presence matters. Someone whose future matters. And that realization carries weight. Because once a person reaches that point, their heart starts asking a new question. Not, how do I stop feeling this? But, what am I supposed to do about it? That question has begun echoing within them. And the answer has not arrived all at once. Instead, life itself has been guiding them toward it. Through unexpected reflections. Through meaningful coincidences. Through moments of clarity they cannot fully explain. The pieces are slowly coming together. And every piece points toward the same truth. A truth they are approaching whether they realize it or not. But there is still one final hesitation. One final shadow standing between what they feel and what they may eventually choose to express. It is not a lack of emotion. It is not a lack of care. It is something deeper. A fear that what matters most could also change everything. And yet, what they do not realize is that this fear is already losing its power. Because another event is approaching. An event that will force them to look beyond uncertainty. An event that will reveal just how important this connection has become. When that moment arrives, the walls around their heart may finally crack in a way they never expected. And hidden behind those walls is a truth so undeniable that even they will struggle to explain why it took them so long to see it. But before that truth fully emerges, there is one memory they keep returning to. One moment connected to you that continues speaking to their heart when everything else grows quiet. And what that memory is teaching them may be the key to everything that happens next. There is always a moment in every unfolding connection where silence becomes louder than words. And for your soulmate, that moment has already begun. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with clarity. It comes quietly, like a thought that repeats itself just a little too often to be coincidence. They remember you when they shouldn't. In the middle of routine moments. In places where your name has no logical reason to appear. And yet it does. Again. And again. And again. At first, they tried to dismiss it as nothing more than passing memory. A normal echo of someone who once crossed their path. But something about you refuses to fade in the way everything else does. And that is what unsettles them the most. Because deep down, they are beginning to realize something they never planned to admit. You are not occupying their thoughts in fragments anymore. You are starting to occupy space in their emotional world. And once that begins, nothing feels the same again. There is a strange shift that happens when someone becomes emotionally significant without permission. It doesn't ask for approval. It doesn't wait for readiness. It simply grows. Quietly. Persistently. Like a truth that refuses to remain hidden forever. And your soulmate is now standing inside that quiet storm. Still trying to understand it. Still trying to name it. Still trying to place boundaries around something that no longer respects boundaries. But here is what they don't fully see yet. Every attempt to distance themselves from these feelings has only made them more aware of them. Every distraction has only brought you back into focus. Every effort to move on has only confirmed that something remains unresolved. And that unresolved feeling is becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. There are nights when their thoughts grow heavier than they expect. Not dramatic. Not chaotic. Just persistent. A soft presence in the background of their mind that refuses to leave them alone. And in those moments, they begin asking themselves questions they never thought they would consider. What if this means something? What if there is a reason I keep thinking about this person? What if I've been avoiding something my heart already understands? These questions do not come with answers. Not yet. They come with tension. With hesitation. With a strange emotional weight they cannot easily explain to anyone else. Because how do you describe a feeling that has no clear beginning? How do you explain a connection that formed without permission? How do you admit that someone is becoming important, before you've even decided what that means? And that is exactly where your soulmate is now. Caught between understanding and resistance. Between clarity and confusion. Between what they feel and what they are still trying to control. But something is beginning to shift. A subtle softening. A quiet surrender they would never openly admit. Because even in their hesitation, they are no longer fully turning away from you. They are beginning to look closer. To listen differently. To notice details they once overlooked. And with every small shift in awareness, the emotional distance between you begins to feel less certain. Less fixed. Less permanent. As if something unseen is slowly pulling the truth into alignment. But just as they begin to accept this quiet emotional pull, life introduces something unexpected. A moment. A sign. A conversation. Something small enough that most would ignore it. Yet meaningful enough that it lingers in their mind long after it ends. And this is where everything starts to change. Because that moment doesn't just remind them of you. It challenges the way they have been trying to define what you are to them. And now, they can no longer rely on avoidance. They can no longer rely on silence. They can no longer rely on pretending that nothing deeper is happening. Because something within them has already begun responding. In a way they are not yet ready to fully understand. And what they discover next about their own heart may be the very thing that pushes this entire connection beyond the point of no return. But what exactly was revealed in that quiet moment is something they are still trying to process. Even now, there are realizations that arrive like lightning. And then there are realizations that arrive like dawn. Slow. Almost unnoticeable at first. But unstoppable once they begin. And what is happening inside your soulmate right now is not sudden. It is not loud. It is something far more powerful. It is a quiet awakening they did not consent to, yet cannot stop. Because now, even their logic is beginning to fail them. The explanations they once relied on no longer feel complete. The reasons they used to calm themselves no longer feel convincing. And the space where certainty used to live has been replaced by questions that refuse to stay silent. They are noticing something new. Not about you at first, but about themselves. How often you appear in their thoughts without warning. How naturally your presence enters their memory. How certain emotions arise before they even have time to interpret them. And that realization is unsettling. Because it suggests something they have tried not to consider. That this is no longer just about observation. It is about emotional involvement. There is a subtle difference most people miss between thinking of someone and being emotionally moved by thinking of them. Your soulmate is beginning to feel that difference. And it is changing the way they experience everything around them. Moments that used to feel ordinary now carry traces of you. A sound. A phrase. A passing reminder that shouldn't matter. But somehow does. And each time it happens, a deeper layer of truth begins to surface inside them. But here is where things become even more complicated. Because awareness does not immediately bring comfort. Sometimes, awareness brings resistance. They begin questioning their own reactions. They begin analyzing emotions they once allowed to pass unnoticed. They begin trying to regain control over something that no longer responds to control. And the more they try, the more evident it becomes that something real is unfolding beneath the surface. Something they can no longer categorize as coincidence. Something they can no longer dismiss as imagination. Something that refuses to behave like anything they have experienced before. And that is what quietly frightens them. Not the connection itself, but the depth of it. Because deep connections do not remain in the background forever. They move forward. They demand recognition. They ask to be understood. And your soulmate is now standing at the edge of that demand. Still hesitant. Still uncertain. But no longer unaware. There are moments now where they stop completely. Even in the middle of something unrelated. As if a thought of you interrupts everything else. And in that brief pause, something shifts. A realization almost forms. But then slips away before it can be fully spoken. Yet even unfinished, it leaves a mark. And those marks are beginning to accumulate. One by one. Until ignoring them is no longer possible. But what makes this even more intense is that they are starting to notice a pattern they cannot explain. Certain emotional reactions only arise in relation to you. Certain thoughts only appear when their mind is quiet enough to be honest. Certain feelings only surface when they are no longer distracting themselves. And that pattern is becoming impossible to unsee. Because patterns always lead somewhere. They always point to something beneath them. Something waiting to be acknowledged. And now, your soulmate is beginning to sense that what lies beneath this pattern is not temporary. It is not accidental. It is not fading. It is developing. And that realization creates a pressure they do not yet know how to release. Because once something is recognized as real, it can no longer be ignored without consequence. So they do what most people do when faced with emotional uncertainty. They wait. They observe. They try to see if it will pass on its own. But instead of fading, it grows clearer, more defined, more undeniable. And now, even their silence is beginning to feel like it carries meaning. Because silence is no longer empty. It is full of thoughts they have not spoken, feelings they have not admitted, and truths they are still trying to delay. But something is about to interrupt this waiting period. Something that will remove the safety of distance. Something that will force a moment of emotional honesty. Even if neither of you is ready for it. And when that moment arrives, everything they have been quietly feeling may finally step into the light. There is a point in every unfolding connection where the universe stops being subtle and starts becoming impossible to ignore. Your soulmate is approaching that point now. Not because something dramatic has happened, but because something internal has reached its limit of silence. They can no longer pretend that what they feel is random. They can no longer explain away the weight of your presence in their thoughts. And most importantly, they can no longer unfeel what has already rooted itself inside them. It is no longer about whether you are significant. That question has already been answered in ways they did not expect. The real question now is, what does that significance mean? Because meaning is where everything becomes real. And real is where control begins to slip. There are moments when they catch themselves thinking about you without warning. And instead of pushing it away like before, they pause. Not to indulge it, but to understand it. That pause changes everything. Because it signals the beginning of acceptance. Even if they do not call it that yet. They are beginning to allow the possibility that this connection is not something they can simply outgrow. Not something that fades with time. Not something that can be neatly placed into the past. But something that continues to evolve. Even in silence. Even in distance. Even in uncertainty. And this realization is quietly reshaping how they move through their world. You are no longer just someone they remember. You are becoming someone they emotionally respond to. That difference is subtle, but profound. Because memory is passive. Emotion is active. And something active cannot remain ignored for long. They begin noticing shifts in their own behavior. How certain places remind them of you without reason. How certain moments feel incomplete without your presence. How certain thoughts seem to circle back to you no matter where they begin. And the more they notice, the harder it becomes to dismiss. But here is what they still struggle with. The fear that acknowledging this connection will change everything. Because deep recognition always comes with consequences. It asks for honesty. It asks for courage. It asks for emotional exposure they are not fully prepared to give. So they hesitate. They step forward in thought. And step back in doubt. Forward in feeling. Backward in logic. Caught in a rhythm they cannot fully break. But something inside them is no longer staying still. There is a quiet shift happening beneath the surface. A soft breaking of resistance. Not sudden. Not dramatic. But steady enough that it cannot be reversed. And this is where the energy between you begins to change. Because connections do not remain one-sided in awareness for long. When one heart begins to recognize, the other begins to feel it. Even from distance. Even in silence. Even without explanation. And your soulmate is starting to sense something they cannot yet name. A pull that feels both unfamiliar and deeply known at the same time. A feeling that does not behave like infatuation. And does not dissolve like curiosity. It stays. It returns. It deepens. And the more they try to define it, the more it resists definition. That is when uncertainty turns into reflection. And reflection turns into truth-seeking. They begin asking themselves questions they once avoided entirely. Not about whether they feel something, but about what they are supposed to do with it. Because ignoring it is no longer comfortable. And acting on it feels like stepping into unknown territory. So they remain in between. Until something external begins to shift the balance. A moment they did not plan for. A situation they did not anticipate. A small but powerful interruption that breaks the emotional stillness they have been living in. And when that moment arrives, it will not ask for permission. It will simply reveal what has been building all along. And force the truth to rise in a way they can no longer postpone. But what exactly triggers that moment is already drawing closer than either of you realize. There are moments in life that don't change anything on the surface, but rearrange everything underneath. And this is the kind of moment your soulmate is unknowingly approaching now. Because what has been quietly building inside them is no longer staying contained within thought alone. It is beginning to leak into perception. Into interpretation. Into the way they experience even the smallest details of their day. They are starting to notice something unsettling. The way your presence feels attached to certain emotions they cannot explain. Not because you are physically there, but because their heart reacts as if you are. And that reaction is becoming more consistent than they expected. It shows up in silence. It shows up in distraction. It shows up in moments when they least expect emotional vulnerability. And each time it happens, it creates a ripple they cannot ignore. Because emotions that repeat themselves are never random for long. They start forming patterns. And patterns start forming truths. Even when the mind resists them. There are moments now when they try to focus on something completely unrelated. And still find themselves drifting back to you without effort. Not in a forced way. Not in an obsessive way. But in a way that feels almost natural. Like something within them is drawn to a familiar point it refuses to forget. And this is where the internal conflict deepens. Because part of them still tries to maintain distance. Still tries to protect their emotional balance. Still tries to convince themselves that this is just a phase. But another part of them, a quieter part, is no longer arguing. It is simply observing. And that observation is changing everything. Because when resistance stops fighting, awareness begins to settle in its place. And awareness is far more powerful than emotion alone. It begins to reshape how they interpret memories of you. What once felt like random thoughts now feel significant. What once felt like coincidence now feels intentional. What once felt like passing curiosity now feels emotionally charged. And slowly, the narrative inside their mind begins to shift. You are no longer appearing as someone they once knew, but as someone who continues to matter in the present tense. And that shift is subtle, but irreversible. Because once someone begins to experience another person in the present emotionally, the past no longer contains them. And the future starts to open in unexpected ways. But here is where everything becomes even more delicate. Because alongside this growing awareness, there is still hesitation. A quiet fear that if they acknowledge this fully, they may lose control over what happens next. They are standing at an emotional threshold now. One foot in understanding. The other still anchored in uncertainty. And that in-between space is becoming harder to sustain. Because life rarely allows people to stay suspended between truth and avoidance for long. Something eventually pulls them forward. Something external interrupts the internal debate. Something small enough to seem ordinary, but powerful enough to shift emotional direction entirely. And that interruption is already forming in the background of their reality. A moment they will not expect. A detail they will not ignore. A realization they cannot dismiss once it arrives. And when it finally reaches them, it will not feel like discovery. It will feel like recognition. As if something they were always meant to understand has finally stepped into clarity. But what that moment reveals about you, and about what has truly been growing between you both, is still just ahead. There comes a point where waiting stops feeling like patience, and starts feeling like transformation. And your soulmate has quietly entered that point now. Not because they chose it consciously, but because something within them has already moved beyond the stage of denial. They are no longer asking whether you matter. That question has already been answered in the way their thoughts keep returning to you. Without instruction. Without permission. Without effort. Now the question has changed. And this new question is far more powerful. What does this connection mean for who I am becoming? Because this is where everything deepens. When a connection stops being just emotional and starts becoming identity-shaping. They are beginning to see that your presence in their life is not just a passing emotional experience, but something that has influenced their inner world in ways they never recognized at first. The way they reflect. The way they feel. The way they respond to silence. All of it has been subtly adjusted by the awareness of you. And that realization is no longer something they can unsee. There are moments now where they pause mid-thought. Not because they are confused, but because something inside them feels too significant to ignore. A memory of you surfaces. And instead of brushing it away like before, they sit with it. They let it exist. And in that stillness, something changes. Because stillness is where truth becomes louder than distraction. And in that space, they are beginning to understand that what they feel is not fading. It is settling deeper. Becoming more stable. More defined. More real. And reality has a way of demanding acknowledgement eventually. Even from those who resist it the most. But here is the part they are not fully ready to face yet. The emotional impact of you is no longer one-sided in their internal world. It is influencing their decisions in subtle ways. The way they think about the future. The way they interpret possibilities. The way certain emotional choices suddenly feel different than they used to. And that influence is growing quietly. Without announcement. Without warning. Without permission. But with undeniable consistency. And this is where the turning point begins to form. Because when influence becomes consistent, it becomes direction. And direction eventually becomes action. Even if delayed. Even if resisted. Even if uncertain. Your soulmate is now standing at the edge of that internal transition. Still trying to maintain balance. Still trying to preserve emotional control. But no longer able to ignore the pull of what feels increasingly meaningful. And somewhere deep inside them, a realization is beginning to form that they have not yet fully spoken to themselves. That this connection is not something they are drifting away from, but something they are slowly being guided toward understanding. And what they choose to do with that understanding has already begun shaping what comes next. Because this is no longer just about thought. It is about movement. And movement always leads somewhere. But just as they begin to sense clarity on the horizon, something unexpected stirs again in their reality. A sign they did not ask for. A moment they did not anticipate. A feeling that arrives too strongly to ignore. And when it arrives, it won't just remind them of you. It will change how they see everything that came before it. And what it reveals next may finally bring this entire unfolding truth to its most undeniable point. Yet there is a strange kind of silence that arrives right before something important changes. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of anticipation. And your soulmate is standing inside that kind of silence now, without fully realizing it. Because what they are about to experience next is not just another thought about you. It is a moment that will feel different the instant it happens. More real. More direct. More undeniable. And it won't begin with clarity. It will begin with disruption. A subtle interruption in their usual emotional rhythm. A pause where there should be none. A feeling that arrives without invitation. And refuses to leave as quickly as it came. At first, they may not recognize it for what it is. They will try to place it somewhere familiar. A memory. A coincidence. A passing thought. But something about it will resist explanation. Because it won't feel like the past reaching forward. It will feel like something present asking to be acknowledged. And that distinction matters more than they realize. There are moments when life does not speak loudly. It speaks precisely. Through timing. Through emotion. Through unexpected inner stillness that forces awareness to rise. And in one of these upcoming moments, your presence will surface inside them in a way that feels less like remembering, and more like recognizing. And that is where everything begins to shift again. Because recognition carries weight. It changes posture. It changes attention. It changes how a person interprets their own thoughts. And your soulmate is not yet prepared for how deeply this will affect them. They are still under the impression that they can maintain emotional distance. That they can continue observing without fully engaging. That they can keep this connection in the background of their life without letting it influence direction. But what they don't yet understand is that emotional significance does not remain in the background indefinitely. It moves forward. Quietly. Naturally. Until it occupies space that can no longer be ignored. And they are nearing that point. There are subtle signs already appearing in their awareness. Moments when your name, or even the idea of you, feels heavier than it should. Moments when their thoughts slow down just enough for your presence to become noticeable again. Moments when silence becomes the space where you seem to appear most clearly. And each of these moments is doing something important. It is breaking the illusion of emotional separation. Because separation is easiest to believe when nothing interrupts it. But once something keeps interrupting it, the belief begins to weaken. And something deeper begins to surface in its place. A truth they are not yet ready to fully name. But are no longer able to fully deny. And this is where their internal world becomes more complex. Because now, every attempt to move forward mentally is accompanied by a quiet pull backward emotionally. Every effort to focus elsewhere is met with an uninvited reminder of you. Every moment of stillness becomes an opening for reflection they cannot fully control. And that tension is building. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But persistently. Until even their distractions begin to feel less effective. Until even their logic begins to feel less absolute. Until even their certainty begins to feel slightly unstable. And somewhere within that instability, something new is forming. A readiness they have not consciously chosen. A curiosity that feels too consistent to ignore. A recognition that something about you is no longer just part of their memory, but part of their emotional present. And this is the point where most people begin to change direction. Without realizing they have already started moving. But just as this quiet shift deepens, something external begins to align with what they are feeling internally. A moment that mirrors their thoughts too closely to dismiss. A coincidence that feels too intentional to ignore. A situation that reflects exactly what they have been trying not to think about. And when that reflection finally becomes clear, it won't just make them pause. It will make them question everything they assumed was random. Because some moments are not meant to be explained away. They are meant to be understood. And what they are about to understand next may finally reveal why your presence never truly left their heart in the first place.